So today has ended up being the day there was Right Front update. I'm in between productions right now, but I felt I absolutely had to put something out today to just punctuate the space. But you'll see next week we've got some good stuff coming along. You'll remember I said at the start of this year that I had a few things in the pipeline, so I'll talk about that more shortly. But first up, something that I felt I should cover for a while, and this is a good space to kind of just throw this in here. And it's something I often see talked about, mentioned of, commented on, which is of course people bemoaning the fact that my primary 40k army is Ultramarines. I hear people going, oh, of course LT plays Ultramarines, blah blah blah. Now, personally, I couldn't care less about people stressing about which colour of toy soldiers I choose to collect. However, what does interest me is the sort of cult of meme which has enveloped Ultramarines over the years. And let's be straight, with good reason. Games Workshop for the longest time put them front and centre, not to mention their lore reputation as the rule sticklers, the Boy Scouts, they've got to do things by the book and so on. And that aspect of how the Ultras are viewed is definitely not lost on me. And especially as somebody who loves things to be pretty grim and dark and gritty with some substance of material behind it. And it may come across surprising then that I, as a 40k collector, painter and player, use Ultramarines. Although it's worth pointing out, I do also have a Biotan Eldar army and an assortment of chaos in an army which is awaiting me to consolidate it and rebuild it as some form which I haven't decided on yet. Although I do always think it's worth remembering that the tale about the Demonculaba and the Iron Warriors, the main character in that is Uriel Ventress, and he is an Ultramarine, and that tale is absolutely amazing. And for many people, a character like Uriel Ventress is one of their first impressions of the Ultramarines Omnibus series, and if you haven't read that, it's really worth going and taking a look at it. But these days, I always think of Uriel Ventress as being one of the kind of core characters that really speaks to the sort of the nature and the impression about the Ultramarines, what the kind of stuff they have to go through. When you consider the actual history of the Ultramarines, I mean, they've been through it. Without sort of going into really heavy specifics, yeah, you've got all that stuff with Uriel Ventress. You've also got the Tyrannic Wars with the Ultramarines and how, you know, you had the First Company basically get absolutely annihilated. And then we've had all the stuff with the 13th Black Crusade and how that's happened and all the stuff around Ultramar and, of course, the Indomitus Crusade and so on and so on. So, you know, there is a load of history there. There's other things as well that we could go down into. But I think on the face of it, it's kind of very disingenuous to kind of just write off the Ultramarines because of their kind of visual presence. Although, kind of ironically, visual presence is exactly why I ended up kind of getting Ultramarines in the first place, as I'll explain. But the majority of all the miniatures I have, I collected as a kid between the ages of 8 and about 15 years old. Past that point, I really didn't buy very much until the past few years. And to know why I, as a kid, chose Ultramarines, you kind of have to travel back to that time and also get into the mind of a very young me and look at what Games Workshop were doing, how 40k was presented to you at that time. Now, the first thing to consider is that back in the 90s of 2nd edition Warhammer 40k, things were really quite different. Primary colours were a really big part of 40k, and although the artwork within the books was quite dark and gritty, and that artwork even now continues to this day in the books, the miniatures and general graphical style were very far away from that. It was very bold, it was very bright, a lot of primary colours. One simple reason I gravitated towards Ultramarines was that when colour was such a very prominent part of the face of the miniatures, the feel, the vibe of the models, and you know, the factions, it just happened to be that I liked blue. It really was quite as simple as that. Also, I'm not sure how many people had similar things, but when I was at school, our year was divided into sort of groups of primary colours, and then I guess we were supposed to sort of academically compete or something. I don't know, I can barely remember, and it all seems pretty stupid as well now. But what I do remember is that my house colour for school when I was very young was blue. So maybe from an early age I was kind of being conditioned to like blue. But another reason was that yes, as now, Games Workshop did seem to lean toward Ultras more often than other chapters. There was a bit more material about them, more images, and they did seem to often get more space and representation in White Dwarf. Now, another thing that becomes relevant here, and that is obviously the time period. Back when I was a kid, the internet was not really a thing. Yes, it was the 90s and it did exist and it was sort of accessible for some people, but what you got to keep in mind, most people that I knew then didn't even own a PC, and I'm talking about families, not specifically my friends. I mean, people in their homes didn't have a PC, even for, say, basic word programming, let alone the internet. And my school itself didn't even start looking at that toward the end of my time at secondary school, that's high school. So the reason that that's important is because my only space for discussing and learning about 40k was basically my friends, White Dwarf, and the Games Workshop store, which happened to be pretty far away from me. So we were very heavily limited on what we could learn, what we could discuss, and really the scope of what existed there. And also a part of that is things like painting tutorials, making scenery, learning about how to paint your models and all this kind of stuff. Games Workshop didn't provide like tons and tons of painting tutorials as they do now, and even then you didn't have the whole range of material that's available online. You didn't have painting things like Siege Studios, or not that I was aware of anyway. So it was very, very, very limited. You didn't have Twitter, you couldn't look up all the cool stuff people were doing, you certainly couldn't ask anybody questions because again, your sort of scope of information availability was very limited. It was just friends and people in the store, and that was basically it. And although you had like these big conventions and big shows and stuff where I'm sure all that kind of stuff went on, gotta remember I was pretty young then. I wasn't going to go to these gigantic shows and stuff. These days it's pretty common for people to go to big shows and so on and so on and so on. But again, back then, going to a big event like that was a huge deal, and it really wasn't something that was kind of in the scope for me to be able to do. And in terms of background and sort of getting a feel for what specific factions were like, again, you basically had the codex, a little bit from White Dwarf, and that was it. And it's really important to understand that there was like no heresy novels, there wasn't all that stuff. There were really no novels of any kind that I can recall anyway. There were no audio dramas to learn pronunciations or get a vibe for things there, which is why even until recently I was certain that Abaddon was pronounced Abaddon, because this is the only pronunciation that I'd ever heard people use my entire life until pretty recently, and collectively everybody that I knew agreed that it must be said that way, along with some other pronunciations. So the point is, the scope of which we had to learn about 40k was very, very narrow, both in terms of images, background material, and White Dwarf at one point published, they did have narratives in White Dwarf as well. They often had narratives, but again, they're sort of short stories. White Dwarf at one point published a fairly detailed explanation about the Ultramarines that you can see right here, and this was really what kind of captured my imagination. Again, because of my age, I wasn't really buying White Dwarf very regularly in the beginning, so each copy was like a treasure for me that I would look over it for weeks and weeks and weeks. So having such limited material available, a single copy of a White Dwarf could have a really huge impact on my imagination and my aspirations for what I wanted to purchase, because I'm seeing those same pictures again and again and again. I'm thinking, oh man, I really want these guys, I want this to, and it kind of really gets in your mind. And then as well, you got to remember, I was pretty young at the time. I had a very limited allowance of just a couple of pounds a week from my parents, so I had to be very careful how I spent that money. And despite that being the case, over the coming years, I was able to then gradually do some small jobs, part-time work, save up my pennies, and over time I managed to build up my army. And actually, just a small aside to that, this is why I've never understood really people complaining about Warhammer being prohibitively expensive. I probably will do a video about this at some point. I've seen other people talk about this on Twitter, and I don't really understand it, okay? I have read into this pretty heavily. I did some experiments recently, and it's like, if you account for inflation, if you go onto the Bank of England's website, they have an inflation calculator. If you look at the prices that were being charged for Warhammer stuff back in the 90s, which I can look up because I have it in the back of the White Dwarfs, there's usually price listings there. If you put the prices for the same miniatures, the same point counts and so on, back then in the 90s, the prices, once you've calculated inflation, actually have not really changed much at all. I think that there are some discussions people have had about price increases to places like the US, and I know that people always talk about Australia and so on and so on, so I'm sure there's a conversation to be had there. But for myself, I don't really see that as being a thing. And then the second part of this is, yes, if you want to go and buy a really huge army, if you've never played Warhammer before and you want to go out day one and buy a great big army, yeah, it's going to cost you. But so will outlaying for any hobby in one huge hit. It doesn't matter what your hobby is. Most hobbies as an adult person, if you're going to take it up, it's going to cost you some money. So while I have a lot of miniatures for 40k, I have a big Ultramarines army and I have all these other stuff as well, I didn't go out and buy that in one huge spending spree. I spent years and years and years building up my army a little bit by little bit, 2-3 models at a time, a few pounds here, box there, because you could buy miniatures for a few pounds when I was a kid, a few pounds here, box there, trading stuff with friends as well, swapping models around. The process itself took a really long time. So all things considered, the reason my army ended up being Ultramarines was just that the Space Marines at the time were basically blue, red, green and yellow. I really liked the look of the blue ones, and that was about it. That was probably about as complicated as my rationale initially was at the time, and they just looked really nice to me. Also, my brother quickly decided that he wanted to collect Blood Angels, Deathwing, Dark Angels. My other friend had Imperial Guard and Tyranids. Nobody really wanted Orcs, and I myself started collecting Eldar very slowly, a little bit on the side, in some very small amounts just for something else to do, along with the Chaos bits and pieces. So that's why I ended up with Ultras. I have lived with my Ultras army for such a long time now. Even though I've sometimes considered adding another aspect, they just feel such a part of my life as I've been collecting them for over 20 years, and it just feels really strange to me to even really consider having anything else in there. The Ultras are my 40k army at this point, and they probably always will be, but not least because I just couldn't be bothered to repaint an army of that size at this point in time. I've got so much invested just physically in time that I couldn't possibly imagine switching it at this time. The only other Astartes force I might add in very small numbers would be something like the Necropolis Guardians, which I showcased the ideas for a little while ago, but so far I haven't even really fully decided the colour scheme. So there you go guys, that is why my force is Ultramarines. Any questions, put them down below and I'll try to answer through today. Okay, next, the channel update. What is going on? So literally later today I'm going to be on the way to London and I'm going to be covering Iron Skull, which is a new painting competition being held by Siege Studios. This is going to be a really great opportunity to see some extremely high-end painting. I know there's some producers going that I'm looking forward to meeting as well, so I'm going to be getting plenty of video and photos for you guys of the event and of all the models, and then I'm going to be right back here tomorrow to smash that into a video for you guys to see what it is all about, or some point this week, because as I say, I've got a few things coming up. If anybody is attending tomorrow and you spot me, you want to say hi, come over, just say hello, it's all good. While we're talking about events, I'll probably be attending Warhammer Fest in May, and that's in the UK, I think it's in Birmingham. I may try and meet up with people should they want to do so. No doubt I'll spot some other producers there again as well. Maybe even I'll get some games with people if that ends up being the case. I'll also say this month of March I'll have a couple of sponsor videos. I've got another Audible thing in the pipeline, but no, it's not like every video is going to be sponsored. One, I don't want to do that. Two, it's not going to be how it goes. It's just that that's how things have ended up kind of lining up this month, but it's all good stuff as well. And then specifically videos that are coming up, I don't want to spoil what I have this week, but I'll have several bits coming out in this next week for you guys, and it's going to be a really busy week for me. And then following on from that will be something that I've been outlining is the first steps into specific Space Marine videos, and yes, that also means Primark stuff. So that is on the table and in my line of sight for upcoming things later this month, and I know many of you guys have wanted me to do that for some time. Doesn't mean there's going to be nothing else going on, but that will be beginning. And then after that, finally, I should be focused on the Origins of Chaos Part 3, for which, for one reason and another, has been pushed back and back and back, and part of that was to do with Psychic Awakening stuff. But trust me, I want it done as much as you guys. And then after that, I have a whole raft of ideas for what's to come. In between these major things will undoubtedly be some smaller videos as well, so it's not just going to be big. There'll be some other bits punctuating stuff. Maybe some painting tutorial things. I know some of you guys have asked me to cover sort of how to strip paint for miniatures. I have done that before, but I can cover it a bit better now. And in fact, I've already got some bits done for that. I also wouldn't mind looking at something like Aeronautica soon, because that's been a relatively new game that's come out in the scope of sort of 40k. It's really intrigued me since its release, and I keep hearing it's a lot of fun, so I'd really like to check that out. My Necromunda stuff I've been working through. There's some bits and pieces related to Necromunda which I want to get into videos on the channel, and then I might consider doing some live streams where, again, I used to do in the past where you guys play against me Necromunda on the live stream. So that could be really fun if I get that going on as well. Lastly, I will just say a really huge thanks to everybody who's been supporting me via Patreon for the last few years. I think I want to shake that up soon. I've got some ideas about what I want to do, and I've been thinking about it a lot, and some other bits and pieces too. So again, there's just a lot going on in my head right now, and it's just a case of getting it all out there. So that's where we are right now, guys. Lots coming out. Thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned for a lot more coming up this week.